Thanks for plugging in. Today we're talking excellence with TE Connectivity and the interconnect specialists from TTI IP&E. It's the news, information, and detail you need to know to stay informed about the latest innovations in all types of electronics connectivity. And now, here's your host, TTI's Scott Stemley.
Thanks, Jim, and hello, everybody. It's great to have you tuning in to our next episode of Talking Excellence with TE and TTI. I'm your host, Scott Stemley, Director of Supplier Marketing for TTI Incorporated. My career in electronics distribution spans 38 years in a variety of roles, including sales leadership, asset management, business development, and supplier marketing. Today, we're kicking off a three-part series with our good friends and partners from TE Connectivity's Connected Living Solutions business unit, where we're going to dive into a few topics related to ensuring connection confidence while considering ergonomics, reliability, and sealing. For this episode, we are happy to have with us today TE Connectivity Global Account Manager, Tyler Schell. Welcome, Tyler. Please tell us a little bit about your career at TE.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here. I've kind of stumbled my way into this industry, really. My passion's always been in drag racing and building drag cars. So wiring and connectors have really become a necessary skill that I've had to add to my quote toolbox over the years. And over the past 15 years, I've held positions in design engineering, quality engineering, field engineering, and most recently, global account management here at TE.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. So today, our topic in this episode, we're going to look at ergonomics and its relationship to the connector insertion force, all while maintaining operator safety, productivity, and component quality. So first question to you, Tyler. What has TE been doing to address interconnect ergonomics with respect to improving the health and safety of an operator on the production floors?
That's something I'm pretty passionate about, Scott. I've also spent quite a bit of time on the production floors as an operator, and you learn pretty quickly that doing a job repeatedly and quickly can have some pretty negative impacts on you. So anything that TE can do to improve that connection is going to be a huge benefit, not only mentally, but physically for the operators. So we look at the overall connection and see what we can do to improve the insertion force, the audible kind of clicks when you mate a connector together, and combine those two factors into a reliable connection.
Are there any additional benefits like efficiency or productivity gains directly tied to this?
When you get to efficiency and productivity, every second counts. High volume, large scale manufacturing, being able to reduce the time required to accomplish a job turns into significant savings. When an operator has to repeat a task and they only have a few seconds to do it, if you reduce that time by a fraction of a second, the efficiency of that can be exponentially improved.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what kind of mating force is considered acceptable? As you think about those repetitive functions and activities, certainly you want the connection system to be reliable. So, what kind of force, do people look at when it comes to, inserting pins, a header into a receptacle?
It's a bit of a complex answer. In short, as low as reasonably possible. But when you look at mating force, you have to consider the job that is being performed. Sometimes they have a very short amount of time, so you want to make sure that you can have a reasonably low force, but high enough to make that connection. As you mentioned before, you have to actually have a reliable connection. So if you have a higher takt time for making that connection, sometimes higher insertion forces are acceptable, especially when you get into some extreme environments. Also, do they have the ability to use a tool? Some of the operators could potentially use a tool to help them make that connection. And that can actually, if they have time to do it, that can be a way that you reduce the mating force required. So in short, as low as reasonably possible, but it's going to be a totally different number for every task that you would have.
So I guess on the other end of the spectrum, what are some examples, associated with high insertion forces? What kind of risks are involved if you've got a system that requires a very high insertion force?
Number one is going to be safety. The Bureau of Labor Statistics They give a number about 33% of all worker-related musculoskeletal disorders comes from ergonomics. And if you can fit the job to the person and help loosen that muscle fatigue, then that will be a huge benefit. Not only where you have the safety aspect, but you also have maybe you're not mating that connection all the way. If there's a high insertion force, the operator is going to stop before that mate is fully made. And that can be a real risk when the reliability of the connection is taken into account.
What are some concerns that you've run into back to the lower insertion force, or just the minimum possible? What kind of reliability concerns have you heard from customers that presents a challenge?
There's a balance there. If we could, we'd make the insertion force 0. But you get into that aspect of, well, now there's not a secure mechanical electrical connection. So the lower the insertion force becomes, in some cases, the weaker that electrical connection is. So you have to really balance a strong electrical mechanical connection with as low as insertion force as possible. We have a few different tips or tricks that we do to accomplish that, but you can get into either failed connections, overheated connections, or in some cases, just like with high insertion force, an incomplete mate where the connector or the terminal is not fully mated and falls off.
Let's move to another facet of this. So connector design. So what kind of design considerations go into optimizing a connection system when you have ergonomics being such an important factor?
Well, number one is the operator. How is this assembly going to be made, and what is a typical operator going to do to make this connection? If you're reaching across a table, for example, or if you are having a push motion directly in front of you, you're going to want to try to fit that connection to the human body, to the operator making the connection. We try to limit what we would call a pinch grip, where you have your thumb and forefinger pinching the connector and pushing it down onto the mating part. Anywhere you can get a thumb or 2 fingers or some big flat surface goes a long way in allowing a safe ergonomic connection. You also want to consider, the angle of the mate, where you're, like I said a minute ago, if you're reaching over something, you're reaching around something, you always want to try to make sure that the connection is being made in a least resistant motion, pushing straight in front of you, pressing down with both hands or 2 thumbs. That's going to give you a much easier force where you're using your big muscle groups, large sweeping motions to make the connection instead of trying to rely on 2 fingers or a pinch or something where you're not having a big flat surface to push on.
Do the base materials or different plating options play into this in any way?
They can, absolutely. When you take, tin plated over a brass terminal, for example, a lot of our base materials would be a brass. That tin plating, while it provides corrosion resistance, it can also provide a little bit of negligible, but a little bit of resistance in having a mate. So when you would have, depending on what your mating part is, you can select different high performance alloys like a beryllium copper or something like that might have a lower coefficient of friction on the surface when you go to mate it.
What about mechanical levers or some type of a lubricant? Do you see those as solutions as well?
That's my personal favorite. Anytime you can get a mechanical lever, you're going to dramatically improve the force, or reduce rather the force required to make the mate. That mechanical assistance is a huge advantage for the operators, where in some cases, if you're mating, let's take a 40 position connector, for example, trying to mate 40 terminals at once would be a huge amount of force required. But with the assistance of a mechanical lever, that force is a fraction of what it would be. Even lubricant's a big factor that comes into play there. You get the added benefit of threading improvements, where you can kind of coat those terminals to prevent any type of oxidation or corrosion. But the other benefit is the insertion force. Anytime you're reducing that coefficient of friction of the 2 mating terminals, you're going to have better insertion forces.
Well, I'll tell you what, I've learned a lot more about mating force and ergonomics in the last 10 minutes, so it's been very insightful. Tyler, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know as it relates to insertion force on a connection system?
Sure. Without giving away too many of our secrets, some of our designs would also incorporate maybe staggering connections. If you have multi-position connections, another thing you could potentially do is stagger the mates. And what I mean by that is where you have during the mate of a terminal to the mating connection, there's a spike in insertion force as the terminal is deformed and kind of comes over that lead in. So anytime you have more than one connection, you're adding those insertion forces up. So staggering those, even by just a fraction, helps to reduce the overall force needed to make that connection. We try to rely on that anyway, or we try to incorporate that anytime we can. And we've seen a big difference in the insertion force required for mating multiple position connections.
All right, great. Well, Tyler, thank you very much. Again, that was quite insightful. I'm sure our listeners are going to be very appreciative of everything that you've covered from this perspective. And, obviously, if there's anything from a question standpoint you have, then please reach out to your TTI sales specialist, and they can be sure to get you in contact with the right folks from TE. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
That's it for this episode of Talking Excellence. Join us next time for the podcast that brings together the specialists of TTI with the connectivity experts from TE, an insightful conversation about getting connected.